Right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to One Tug. Today is not the 14th, it's the 28th. So we forgot to change that from our last meetup. So it's the
Yeah.
28th of October, and I think we got the speaker right though, Brian McKeiver. I'm sorry, am I getting your last name correct? Okay, Brian McKeiver, and he will be talking about supercharged static sites in .NET with Statiq and Azure. And I am certainly interested in hearing about that. I haven't done a lot of front-end work lately, but I've been always dabbled in Azure Functions, and I want to see how this kind of ties into my knowledge of Azure Functions. This meeting is being recorded, so if you do not consent to this recording, please, exit the meeting or do as you will desire. So today's agenda will have the welcome and announcements. That will only take a few minutes. This talk is recorded and will be available on our YouTube. I will post the YouTube link shortly. And then Brian will kick it off with his talk. Just a couple of reminders. If you stay on mute as far as possible, and stay off camera as far as possible. So there's the button. Depending on your client, it could be at the top, bottom of your screen, but those are the logos. And if you have questions, especially while Brian is talking, the best way to get those answered is to use the raise your hand from the emojis at the top. So when you raise your hand, one of us will tag you and we will interrupt Brian. This is to prevent from multiple people interrupting the speaker at the same time. So who are we? We are the Orlando.NET user group, or One Tug. And we also run the Orlando Code Camp. And Brian has been our speaker with Orlando Code Camp in the past, and it's always been a great experience. And these are the people behind the show. How to get resources on OneTug? It's really easy. You can go to onetug.net, right? OneTug for .NET, .NET user group. So that should be pretty straightforward. For Meetup, you simply add /Meetup. For Twitter, you simply add /Twitter, and so on. And the YouTube channel that I was talking about, that's right here. So if you go to this, it'll take you to our YouTube channel. For any questions, concerns, anything you want to talk about, you can always email the board at onetug.net. Upcoming meetings, we are talking to Facundo, who is a local speaker, and he will be talking about GitOps. It's sometime in November, most likely, or the 11th. Yeah, please mute yourself. Thank you. Monthly sponsors, we do not have a sponsor as of now. Apparently, the sponsors love in-person meetups and they don't like online meetups, but that's quite okay. I mean, it's pretty cheap to run, so we're always happy to bring this content to you for free. But if anyone is interested, this does reach a lot of people, so you might want to consider sponsoring this because you'll get on a video on YouTube, and a lot of people see this. If there are any community announcements, you can raise your hand and then we will try to get you in for community announcements. So I do have one. I think Ignite is, there's a few events, right? There's Ignite, there's the .NET conference, there's the release of .NET 6. So, November is going to be an exciting time. So, next week.
And the VS22 launch.
VS22.
VS 2022 launch, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So all of those are happening in November, so just keep an eye out for that. I will actually be speaking at the .NET conference. on feature management APIs. So, if you watch that, give me, like and subscribe, give 5 stars, whatever. Brian. So who's Brian? Brian is a speaker that I have ran into on the speaker circuit. He has given a couple of talks at Orlando Code Camp, and I've also met you at other conferences, I'm pretty sure. Owner and architect at BizStream. Is this is in your hometown? Is that correct, Brian? It's in Allendale, Michigan. Brian seems to be a Michigan native. Graduated from Grand Valley State, computer science, and he's been, around since the beginning of .NET. Did you work on the initial versions of .NET, or did you just switch?
1.0 beta, yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, so that's me too. So, we have something in common there. So then, this is where you can reach Brian on his blog, mcpeve.org, and he's a Kentico Xperience and Kentico Kontent MVP. And one of 2 people in the world with all the, who's the second person? Just out of curiosity.
His name is Andrew Thompson. He's in Sydney, Australia, so pretty far.
Wow. Awesome. So with that, I am going to stop sharing and I will hand it over to Brian. And Brian, you can start sharing and take it away. And like I said earlier, if you have questions, please use the raise a hand feature. And as far as possible, stay on mute and off camera unless otherwise needed.
Okay, I'm hoping at this point everyone can see my screen and hear me okay. Can I get a check? Does that sound all right? And you can see it?
Yep, we can see you, we can hear you.
Awesome, thank you very much. And let me get to the right focus. All right, so thank you, Santosh and OneTug for allowing me to speak at your meetups. Yeah, like I said, I've been kind of a fan from afar, traveling down to Orlando, speaking at the Code Camps a couple times. And I think you've got a great community going, and I commend you for that. That's not easy to keep it going for such a long time. So really good job, and thanks again for having me. My topic today is all about generating static sites with a technology called Statiq with a Q, and doing that with .NET technologies that we all might know some of, but not all of. So I'm going to highlight a couple .NET technologies that go right along with this story. And also talk about why I'm calling it Supercharged, because of various reasons. So we're going to get right into it. As soon as I find my mouse. Okay, so not going to spend a ton of time about me. Also, is that blinking for you guys?
No, it's
okay.
fine.
It's weird. The monitor's blinking for me. All right, I'll deal with it. The About Me slide is up here, but we kind of did my intro. So I am co-owner at BizStream. We are a custom software development shop in Allendale, Michigan, real close to Grand Rapids, Michigan, on the west side of the state. And I always tell everyone it's beautiful to come to in the summer because it's really nice. But man, don't come here in the winter because it's ugly and it's snowy and it's cold and it's just not a lot of fun. But other than that, really happy and proud of my West Michigan-ness. My specialty and day-to-day job is to be a software solution architect for our clients across North America. We have lots of them, and we do lots of content management implementations for these organizations where their site needs to integrate with multiple things. It needs to do maybe e-commerce. It needs to have CRM connectivity. It needs to pull data from SharePoint. It's kind of these big systems that they need a great way to solve technology challenges, but also have really good marketing experience for content authors to create content quickly, to publish it quickly. And that's where a content management system comes into play. And I get to do that every day. And for my kind of just experience in the community around content management with Kentico specifically, again, I'm a Kentico MVP and happy about that as well. Been using Azure for quite a while as well. If anybody else remembers, one of the first versions of the portal was done in Silverlight. And if you want to talk about Silverlight after this, we can grab a beer and talk about it because it's also a fun thing to talk about these days and reminisce. But anyways, that's all about me. Oh, come on. The reason I am inspired enough to give a talk like this is because I believe that there is a future coming for web development that's all about being API first. And when I say API first, what I mean is that it's really about stitching together lots of different APIs that do different things. And sometimes when we think about API first, we also throw in this idea of JAMStack or static sites. And for a while, those sites were kind of small proof of concept sites. They were simple. They were maybe just a read-only blog. And I'm here to tell you today, there are some very large organizations that rely on static sites and a JAMStack solution to do very big, very powerful, very dynamic things. And now you can even do that in the Microsoft.NET world. So there is a common misconception that is this just meant for a blog? And I would like to educate people that no, it's not just meant for a blog these days. And when I say static sites, what I'm kind of defining is on the left-hand side of the screen. What that means is your browser on your workstation reaches out to a URL and it's delivered a static HTML file and all of its HTML DOM, all of its CSS, all of its JavaScript, and maybe even some of the images are there already as an immediate response. There is no server processing involved. That would be more of the old traditional style on the right-hand side of the slide where we talk about like dynamic sites that have maybe a different set of web servers behind it. They call databases. There's a different content management system in play like a Sitecore or Sitefinity or even WordPress. And it's doing dynamic composition at runtime to put together a page. Maybe there's like templates and it's getting its content from a database. It's putting those things together and then it's submitting that to the browser. And that's okay. We've done that way for years, but sometimes that's slow. And nowadays, speed is a big concern for many brands out there because the faster your site loads, the more search engines like you, right? And using static sites is a great way to accomplish speed and a couple other benefits, actually. And we sum that up in this little friendly term called JAMStack. And that means kind of a JavaScript API and markup-based solution that gives you lots of benefits. Number one is speed and performance. But also because there's no server behind the scenes, it's a very small surface area for risk of attack. Because of that, there's a high security that comes with it because you may have an HTML page sitting out on an S3 bucket in Amazon or a blob storage container in Azure or somewhere in Rackspace. It's just a static file. There's nothing to try to inject attack to or get around it or try to log into an admin tool that may have weak passwords. That just doesn't exist because the only thing there on your site is a set of pre-generated, pre-built static files. So high security is a big benefit of that. It's also very scalable because you can deploy it to multiple places on a content delivery network across the globe. You can make it very performant at the edge, as they like to say, for when you're consuming these assets. And it's something that we would really love doing these days because we like having good user experience and good page load speeds for our visitors, no matter where they are coming from. And then lastly, the thing that maybe not rises to the top when you think about like JAMStack or static sites, it's the fact that working in this technology is actually a little bit of fun. It's a little bit less to worry about. You can kind of make changes, use tools that you're used to working with like a static site generator that connects to your GitHub repo that publishes using actions and does things to put things up into Azure or other places. It's all things that you can basically just do with VS Code and a simple subscription to Azure. So, and I'm going to show that today. I'm going to show what this looks like. But generally, there's a lot of benefits around JAMStack, which is what I'm showing here. It kind of works like this. Basically, you have moved the performance time of generating pages to your build time. So when you build a project on your machine using code or using Studio or whatever tool, Writer, it doesn't really matter, you're building every possible page variation that makes up your site, whether it's 3 pages, because it's a home page, a contact us page, and about us, or it's 3,000 pages because you have a product catalog, you've got a ton of news articles. It generates all of that at build time, so it can be put in as part of your CI/CD process, And when you commit the files, you can kick off a build that generates a site. And that's where some of the power of Azure Static Web Apps comes in, but we'll get there. And then again, the idea is not to just be purely static and built once and then never changed. We make it dynamic, or we make it do advanced things like login using an API, or e-commerce checkout using an API. We pull in the A in JAMStack to merge APIs together to do the things we need to do in modern web development. You know, authentication, profile sign-in is a big one. E-commerce is one. Maybe generating dynamic content. You've got a calculator. Maybe you've got a React little app inside of your website that does filters on a grid. All of that is still possible using this type of solution. It's just you do things a little bit differently than what you've done in a very traditional old way that maybe like .NET Framework 2.0 would have done. So let's get right to it. There are many static site generators out there in many different technologies, but I like this one because it's in the .NET world, and it's called Statiq. With a Q, of course. You've got to be fancy with the naming. It was called something else in the past. I think it was like YNAM in the past. This is a better name, in my opinion, better branding. And Statiq is a website that you can hit. It's static.dev/web. It's basically an open source project, and it has all sorts of instructions, documentation, downloads to get started. There's a starter kit, and it's basically a tool that you have a project that you put on your machine, and you're going to build it using VS Code to do your work. And I'll show that in a second. But if you want to check it out, that's the URL to start with. And it's, like I said, it's a .NET-based technology and platform. So I'm not going to do too much in the world of code, but I thought I would at least highlight the basics. What happens with Statiq is your program.cs file, your old traditional main file, has what's called a bootstrapper that Statiq's libraries give you. And that bootstrapper's job is to kind of set up, how do you want the Statiq framework to work? So here, this is the most basic starter example. I'm saying use a bootstrapper. That's the default settings. And by default, it's going to take input files in one format, look for a MVC type of view, potentially, to map the input file to a view, almost like you're retrieving data from a database to populate a view model that would populate a view in the traditional MVC core world. It kind of has the same approach, using this as the starting point, and then it just runs and outputs the files from that merge of the input. And the bootstrapper sets up the basic framework. It's a little bit like starting up a web application in ASP.NET Core, if you're familiar with that. You get that going, and from there you add what's called a pipeline. And there can be as many pipelines as you want. You can do very different things with pipelines. This is a simple example that says, I'm going to look for anything in the content/home markdown file. Take the content of that markdown file, try to process it and extract information out of it, and use that to fill a view model that populates a Razor syntax view. And when it goes through all that work of those first couple lines of code, it's going to take the output of that and create index.html based off of a home.md markup file. So it's doing a whole lot there, but it's doing it in like less than 30 lines of code. And this is just one example of a pipeline. You can combine pipelines together to get information from different sources. I'll show that in a little bit. But generally, the idea is take an input. How do you want to render it using Razor? And then make it an output. And for this example, we're going from home to index.html. And this is what the view model looks like, the view itself looks like, the Razor view. We've got very familiar .NET technologies. I would hope that most people on the .NET user group would kind of understand this syntax. But this is, again, we're just taking a view model, using those properties to generate HTML based off the way Razor likes to do it. And this is the input and output of those two things. So the input is the markdown file at the top. We've got some front matter that has some content. When the static process runs that I just walked through, the bootstrapper fires up, runs the pipeline. This is the output that you get from that code. So from Markdown to HTML in a very simple, pretty easy way for a .NET developer to understand. And I would say it's supposed to just me talking through it. Let me actually show that, and I'm going to build it and run it as our first demo. And it's going to take a second to do that while I switch focuses. Oops. So I have a static project, and I'm starting at program.cs right here. This is a bootstrapper. I've got a few extra things. Just pay no attention to lines 18 through 24 right now. And of course, as I say that, you're going to look at those lines of code. But bootstrapper to pipeline. Here's that home pipeline sample code that I just kind of talked through. Inside of my project, I have an input and output directory. So in my input directory, I'm going to expand that out a little bit. In my input directory, I have that markdown file for home. And this is the home markdown file that we just kind of looked at. So I can change this. I can do certain things with it. And it kind of runs that through and generates the output of that file as index.html. Right? So there's me talking through it. But now actually let's watch the process. I'm going to do a .NET build just because I'm old school and I like building my projects before I run it. It's still kind of an old habit. Just like to make sure I didn't break anything since restarting my computer before the meeting today. I'm hoping this builds because no one wants to watch me debug code today. That's not my goal for tonight. It's already too late for that. All right, great. So that worked. And now I'm actually just going to call a .NET run. And what that's going to do is it's going to run those pipelines, look for those inputs, generate all the HTML that matches our layout and our view, dump all the pages it needs to find, and then finish and run our output. And frankly, it doesn't usually take this long. Usually it takes about a second or two. While it's doing that, I will note that the more content that you have to generate, the longer the build time will take. That's kind of normal in the static site generator world. And other technologies have some new incremental static site features, but static isn't quite there yet. I'm sure it'll get there soon. But there we are, we're done. So what that did is generate a new output file, and actually the output didn't change, so the code didn't pick it up. But if I wanted to, I could simply go to that folder in Explorer, and I could actually see, well, I can see it on this monitor, but let's make sure you guys can see it on this monitor. I could actually see in my output directory, oh, try that again, in my output directory, there's my index.html. And if I look at that guy, here we are. We have the content from the markdown file populating the H1. We have the text of the content attribute in the attribute, and then we have an image that I just kind of threw up there. And then these are future examples below. Now, it's not great to have to browse an HTML file on your local machine. So one of the cool things that Statiq does is it comes with its own little preview web server. So instead of having to open up Explorer and then double click a file, if you pass the right parameters, Statiq will actually start up a localhost development server that will serve out your HTML and kind of work with the different files that you have. So now that that's finished, it shows that I'm running on localhost 5080. I'll control click that. And now this is a better example, right? We actually have a running website that has this set of content, not just clicking the index.html raw file explorer path. So it's kind of got the tools that you can actually run and watch and do things locally as needed. Does that make sense so far? Any questions? Because this is the basic building block of the rest of the things that we're going to talk about tonight. So if there's any questions, feel free to ask them now while I switch back.
I have a question. So you said that the bigger or the more the content, the longer .NET run takes. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So is that Can it be, can the time be reduced by scaling up the machine that the .NET Run is running on, or what can be done to alleviate that? I'm imagining that, there are some pretty big websites that you have to deal with. So.
Yeah. So the more horsepower of the instance or the machine that you're running it on, the faster it's going to go. There's also some tricks to defer execution of some of the parts of your site and load those from an API after the fact. That I actually show something that's somewhat related to that, but that's a good question. Yeah. So basically it's throw more horsepower at it, or incrementally build only parts of your site at a time, or kind of use an on-demand system that maybe only you build one page at a time based off of a trigger. So there's definitely ways in this architecture to make it go faster. But good question. All right. So that walkthrough got us to here. I've walked through everything on the left. The fact that Statiq took that markdown file and generated the HTML. Now what are we going to do with it? That is then where the rest of the solution starts to come into play, at least in this basic example so far. Traditionally, what you would do, because these are all files that you've just built, you would make a commit. And you maybe even make a PR to push it into a branch that has a auto deployment set up or a GitHub action. So I'm going to talk about doing that next. And because at the end of the day, to serve this content out as a website to actual people on the internet, we need to get it up in the cloud. We need to put a CDN behind it or something that actually gets that static content to the client browser, right? So, so let's take it to the cloud. Where can I host my static awesomeness? And what I'm suggesting is the perfect pair for this technology is Microsoft Azure Static Web Apps. If you haven't heard about Static Web Apps, they've come about in the last year and a half or so. I've actually used them on a production project and a lot of other sandbox playground projects, and I'm very happy with them because it's really simple to get going and it has a lot of automatic features and benefits that make it highly usable. So if you want to do this on your own, you can very easily go to the Azure Portal. If you have like an Azure free subscription or developer subscription, or even if your organization pays for you to have Azure Spend, you can click Create a Static Web App, and you're off and running in a very little amount of time. In fact, when you click the Create button, the very next thing it does is it says, okay, where would you like to create this? What name would you like to give it? Typical Azure Portal stuff for resource management. And there is a free tier and a standard tier. We'll talk about that later. What region do you want to put it in? And what GitHub repo are you going to tie this to? And that actually is the major point here is the only way that static web apps work is if you actually have a GitHub repo ready to go with your content that you want to push to them. They very tightly tied these two things together. And that's to provide this automatic integration with a couple different things. Mainly, the minute you approve a PR or merged into a branch, you get automatic deployments through the actions that they build for you. So this can start out as an empty repo, or it can be a fully fledged repository, however you want. And when you click that sign in with GitHub, it asks you to connect your account, which is the box here in the lower hand corner, and finish this process. The portal or the Azure provisioning will actually reach into your repo and make you a couple files that handle generating the workflows to do the CI/CD. So you don't have to do anything; it just does it for you, which is actually very cool. And it has more benefits. So, like I just said, it builds and deploys very easy to GitHub, makes it very simple to get this up and running. It can globally distribute things to make the static apps, or maybe you have just a React app. That also works just fine. You don't have to use Statiq to use Azure Static Web Apps. I just want to make that point. You can do any static file stuff you want, whether you made a React app from hand or Vue.js or whatever. Any client-side technology can be hosted in Azure Static Web Apps. Even Blazor, you may have heard of that technology recently. So it comes with some automatic managed Azure functions that are serverless. I'm going to show that today because I think that's a really cool, powerful part of it. It has routing in there if you want to use it. You don't have to use it, but it will do a level of routing, the Static Web Apps. free SSL certificates for 2 domains, which is pretty neat. I hate dealing with SSL, so when it just comes with it, that makes me happy because I don't have to think about that. And it has integrated authentication with Azure AD. You can actually set up role-based routes to make sure that if someone tries to hit that route, the system will actually push them to authenticate into an organization. That's pretty darn cool. And it's building some automatic staging sites for you on a commit. So again, it's one thing to talk about it, but I thought let's actually show it. So I'm going to go back here to my function, to my static site. I'm going to cancel serving the output of that. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a change. And what I'm going to do is, you know what, I'm going to change the content of the markdown file. And what's today? Today's 20th, yeah. So I'm just going to change the title a little bit. And add some content in there. So I've got that change. And I'm going to do a .NET run. Because again, I have to build my project to make the changes happen when I'm changing my content. And it's going to build all those files out. Did that much faster this time, so I'm happy about that. And all of a sudden my repo is picking up the fact that I've got changes waiting for me. So I don't quite have my git ignore perfect yet, but I'm just going to push all those changes. And commit them, and then actually push them into my GitHub repo that has this project. So that's going to take a second. While that works, I'm going to flip back over to GitHub. By the way, everything I'm showing today, I do have at a public repo, Static Azure Web App demo. I think I've got the link at the end, but in case it's not there, I'll provide it. You can get in the recording, but here it is. It knows that we made a push to develop, so I can make a PR based off that push. I'm going to do that. And again, this is kind of what I was saying about the benefit of like the developer experience. This is all stuff that we're used to doing as developers, right? We're used to making changes in code, running things, committing them, and pushing them to a repo. And the cool thing that's going on here is the second I opened up a PR, it's actually kind of making a automatic staging site that's not a production site, it's a staging site that represents this build of my entire website. And this does take like a minute or two, because what it's also doing, well, I'm going to hold on that for now, but it's doing a couple other things around API management and things like that. But it's basically generating an entire site on the fly. And when this automation finishes, it's going to give me a URL that's specific to this PR. And if I keep making more commits and keep modifying things, that environment stays alive, that URL stays alive, and all my changes start showing up almost as soon as these builds finish. Now, I do wish they were a little faster, especially when I'm sitting here talking to a group of people. But trying to fill some space for this thing to actually do its work. Again, it's usually about a minute. And any day now, it's going to finish. Never fails when you want to show someone, right? Live demos. Well, what's going to happen is it's going to take that content and it's going to use this as the base URL.
Sorry.
Yep.
You're waiting on that. You know, earlier when you created the Azure Static Web App, you're in the create screen for Azure Static Web App. It had GitHub and other options. Is the other basically like all Git repos?
Yes.
Like,
yep. I'll Git repos. I think you can use like Bitbucket. I mean, you probably can use what's the other one?
Azure DevOps, Gitbucket.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yep. Good question. Now, so that finished, perfect amount of time. And it said, hey, your stage site is ready to view. It did that for me. And I clicked that stage site. And now it's not just on my local machine, it's up and available. And you can see those were the same characters I just typed in, and I just changed the title. And now I have a live website that has that content. And you'll notice I'm hitting refresh. That page is refreshing as fast as possible. In fact, it's going very, very fast. Again, one of the benefits of doing this is you get very fast loading web pages. So that's an example of using a commit and a PR to automatically create a stage site out of your content that's coming from that markdown file. I think that's pretty cool because in a matter of minutes, we're up and running. But it's honestly, oh shoot, that's the wrong slide. Sorry about that. All right, so we created our static web app. We did that. We went through these benefits. We ran our demo. Now, the other thing is, if you don't want to go all the way up to Azure to begin with, there is an Azure Static Web Apps CLI tool that came out somewhat in the last 2 or 3 months, maybe even 6 months. I don't remember exact timing. This is a way that you could run that locally on your machine again. And you have some choices. You could either run the static local web server to preview your stuff, or you could actually use this. This will actually set up the framework of the entire static web app. And it, again, would run it as a CLI tool. And you can actually do some testing with more of your APIs, which we're going to get into in a second. So this is kind of a cool tool that goes in combination with these technologies. To be honest, I don't use this one a ton yet because it's new, but I believe it would be very powerful if you were doing lots of things with this. So what I'm really trying to show is that we're building up the building blocks from static site generator to GitHub repo, and now we've involved the Azure Static Web App to serve out the content. I think that's pretty cool, but not all the way yet, because we still just have a purely static site. Nothing is supercharged yet, if you will. And at this point, I say let's do that. Let's make it dynamic, and let's add in similar technologies in this world that you would use to make a real live website, not just like a hello world page, right? So making it dynamic usually required what's called a headless CMS as one option if you want a content management experience where marketing people can go make content and change the content, or you can also use serverless functions like Azure Functions to pull information from like a database or wherever else, Cosmos DB, doesn't matter. You can do all of that with basically using APIs that the static web app gives you. So I'm going to first walk through using a headless CMS. Again, this is my favorite one because I use it all the time. Kontent by Kentico is a fantastic headless CMS. It provides an API first experience that allows you to build content and deliver it over an API that you don't have to worry about. It's out there, it's fast, it's super powerful. It does a lot of things. And it runs off of the Azure infrastructure globally, as well as uses Fastly for CDN. So it's very, very fast, very powerful. And what we're going to do, that's the wrong one, sorry. We're going to add content into the solution to take away the need of having to have the content on your local repository and get the content into a real solution that allows multiple people to work on it and actually build real stuff. So let me do the demo of that. And one thing that I want to show first is the content management system. So this is content. I've logged into it very quickly. What I have here is a very simple home page, just like we were looking at the Markdown homepage. Now we're looking at a home page that's in a CMS that has a couple structured fields, and there's a published copy to it. I have home, I have a title, I've got that same summary, and I've got an image in this solution. And what happens here is this all gets delivered over an API. I'm going to consume that API in my C# project, my static headless test project, and I'm going to use that as the source of content instead of Markdown files to make it dynamic. Right. So back over to our VS Code instance, and I have a separate pipeline to do this because now we're doing something different than that first pipeline. Remember the first pipeline, it was looking at a Markdown file, mapping it to a Razor view, and then outputting index.html. This is actually configured to call a API call. That's the sort of the content delivery API is what Kontent with a K calls it. And I'm saying call to their API and get me the code name of home, which is the page in the CMS. Give me only one of them just in case there's more than one page, and make me index from cms.html from that. I'm still going to rely on the home razor syntax to do the display layer of my app, but I'm basically saying I want to look at this as my source now. I want to look at this API response as opposed to looking at a markdown file. And there's a couple different ways that you could do the call to the headless CMS, but this is the simplest one. So I'm just going to stay there. And actually, one other somewhat important thing is you'll note that in home CMS or home CSHTML, I have a home view model that has all of strongly typed properties, right? Title, content, source description, hero, image width. That obviously is coming from my view model file. And here is where I'm actually filling the response from content, which is a model in itself, to map to my view model. So I've got some code that is actually kind of, think of this as if you had even like EF Core or your own database calls, you're still going to populate the model from some repository or something. That's exactly kind of what we're doing here. So we've got that because this hero image, URL, title, and content, those are the same things that we've called these fields. Let me create a new version. You can actually see it a little bit better. So we've got, title, content, and hero image. That's where these things come from. So if I, type in here and change it and do things like that, I still have those fields. I've defined that as my content model in the CMS. And it's again, we're lining up the same sort of fields, but maybe I don't want to create this from scratch every time. There's actually a way to generate these models and again, kind of automate some of this. But based off our time so far, I'm going to skip that for now. But basically, I'm just saying it's all coming from the CMS. And since I already ran it, I don't need to run it again because we've deployed this already. And that is building this index from CMS route or HTML. Oops, sorry, that's my local. I didn't want to click that because I stopped running that. I actually wanted to click this one. This is back where at our staging site where the PR came from. I actually have that index from CSHTML, and that is now a page that loaded its content from content with a K. And we asked it to do one page, but you could ask it for all of the pages of type home or all of the blog posts of type blog post. I'm trying to keep it simple, but just show you that even though we ran it one time, we actually ran two pipelines. One brought the markdown, one brought in the content CMS, and we're good and off and running. We have our more realistic web page because now this can be modified by content editors, built, run, committed, and pushed to a site, and we're off and running. So that's integrating it with a headless CMS to make it more dynamic than just pure static content. Hoping that everyone's with me so far. Let's go back to here. All right. Now, the second part of making a static site dynamic is, like I said, not just using a headless CMS, but also using functions or API calls. And one of the powers that Static Web Apps does for us is gives us managed Azure Functions. It provides a built-in /API that's local to our project that we can generate JavaScript-based Azure Functions, and it automatically hooks those up and provisions them for us in each of these environments for every PR and for every master deployment, our main deployment. It does that by recognizing in your code anything underneath an API structure, and anything that has the kind of the JavaScript-based Azure Functions set up. It finds those in your code as long as you configure things the right way, and basically it just adds these APIs for you. And this is what it looks like when you click Functions inside of the Azure Static Web App. So I think that's worth checking out, and that'll be kind of one of the last demos I've got going on here. But this is where I get really excited about this stuff, because this is the screen I was just showing. We have a production environment as one of the first choices. And then we also have an environment that was specifically created from our PR. So if you have multiple PRs, you get multiple environments. You get multiple URLs where you run these things at. So if I switch to that, I'm actually going to see just the same two functions. They're both get content and get message. Now I can't exactly manipulate the functions here because these two functions are coming from my code base. So inside of input, I have an API folder, and I have two subfolders of get content item and get message. That matches those two things we were just looking at. And when you create or provision an Azure Static Web App, it gives you these files. It gives you a like a starter template that has get message as the default one that it comes with. And inside of index.js, this is my very simple JavaScript-based Azure function. So it has a way to log, which can go to application insights because that's automatically built in as well. It has a way to respond to the query string variables that you send it. And what this is doing is a simple like hello world example. I'm passing name into the function and I'm returning hello name basically. And I'm doing that by just responding in the body. So very simple JavaScript based function. And that gives me this button right here. So I've got this button wired up to call that API. I have it set up to call with Brian as my name to that call, and this proves that that just did that. Now, the first time you run it, it's actually kind of spinning up the Azure function, and it was because it was cold from we just deployed, and it's usually not that slow. If I run it again, it probably already finished. It's very fast to do this. And in case you've ever worked with Azure Functions before, normally you'd have to like go create a function app. You'd have to define a function. You'd have to do some more configuration to get all this working. And then you'd have to worry about cores, requests. We don't have to worry about that here because that's all part of your same domain and it's just all done by you. That's why that deployment took a second or two because it deployed those Azure functions at the same time it deployed the content. So that's one example of calling a very simple API. I think that's pretty cool because I've had to do all that before and it takes a lot more time to do it when you have to create each Azure function and do certain things in there versus just commit, push, and wait for a deployment to happen. Anyone else think that's pretty cool? All right, I'll take that as yes.
Yeah, I tweeted it out that it's cool.
All right, so the other thing to talk about is when it's a more complex function, when it's not just like echoing a string, you can actually kind of do other things. So these Azure functions are using Node, and what I wanted my other API call to do is to call another API, which is a common pattern in this static site JAMStack world. You know, we have our endpoint that we control, but we're actually going to call a different endpoint and pass it through. So this Azure function is using a package or an npm component node fetch so that I can actually make requests out to other APIs from my API. And what I'm doing here is I'm saying, look at the query to this call, and based off the query, build a URL that says go to Kentico content, hit that URL, and retrieve that content, and then return the response to my HTML. So what that's doing is actually asking for a testimonial, just as a different content type. And I have one for one tug set up. And again, this is a way of kind of adding more dynamic aspects to your static site. I'm requesting by the code name to go after and populate this content. It's something I grabbed from the site, and it looks like this is what Joel said back in a while ago. So this is what I'm doing by building this URL and then returning the item's value. And just a quick show the result of that. That's this bottom thing. So I have one tug set up as the code name of the testimonial. We'll call that button. And now I've got content out of the delivery API from content with a K. And again, we can make this dynamic. And in the real world, that might be useful if you have a scroller that does a lot of testimonials we do this all the time for our clients. You might have like a client logo, a name, and a quote, and you need that horizontal carousel to rotate. But maybe you want to make sure it comes in only when someone scrolls down far enough on a page. Again, that goes to the whole optimization and making it all go faster thing. Not only does the web page load faster, the project builds faster as well. So this, just to show you, it is purely dynamic. Here's another one. I have a testimonial on Statiq. Now I'm getting Statiq is the currently the only static site manager for net, and I think I have one for Kontent as well. So you could rotate through this to make that component come to life on your website. And again, you can call other APIs as well too, but I just thought this was a good example of calling those things. And that all came out of the fact that we have that content set up right here. So here's that testimonial that I actually said about content, blah, 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 blah. It comes out. All that's possible through the automatically provisioned Azure Functions. And that is a very good way to make your website dynamic. Okay. Why would we do all this? Speed is the number one reason, like I said. If you look at that web page and you look at the response time, we're less than 100 milliseconds to deliver this page. I think that's fantastic. I think that's really fast compared to other sites. And we didn't even get into like caching and content delivery networks. Now, obviously, this is a very simple page, but it's a full HTML page, and not too many full HTML pages load in less than 100 milliseconds because there's no server time waiting for generating something from a SQL database. That just doesn't exist. So to me, that's a really huge reason why we would use this technology, and it's one of my favorite reasons. Anytime that we talk about new technologies, sometimes there's pricing involved. I felt like it was fair to talk about pricing. So Statiq is a free open source project. There's a open source mentality here that we can think of. There's free, but no software is really ever free. So there's also a private commercial use license. It's $50 per developer per major version. I think that's very fair compared to other products in the market. And again, this is still it's a newer technology. I wouldn't even call it 100% finished yet. I know that the contributors to the project are still working on it. But again, if you're going to use it, you might want to pay for the support for it. That's usually what I try to do for people. Azure Static Web Apps, however, I almost fell out of my chair because for the first year, the whole technology was completely free. There was no charge. It was in preview, so it was completely free. It just came out of preview about 6 months ago or even 4 months ago, and it starts at $9 a month. So not only do we get fast, we also get pretty darn cheap when it comes to just the first two components. So you could build a very static site for a very little amount of money and have really good developer experience. That's a pretty good trifecta in my mind. Now, I'll be honest, Kontent by Kentico is mostly enterprise focused. It's not necessarily for lots of free projects. However, there's a free developer plan that you can start with, but there's paid tiers that go up from there, and it starts at like $1,200 a month. So again, it's a little bit more enterprise focused, but a lot of organizations are moving towards JAMStack in that way. So I kind of want to leave a few benefits of these technologies in case you just need summaries. I thought this would make sense. So Statiq, it's really, in my mind, very friendly for us as .NET developers. There are a lot of other ones out there: Gatsby.js, Next.js, Nux.js. They're very much JavaScript only, focused on React and things like that. And I am a .NET guy at heart, so that's not my wheelhouse. I'd rather work with Razor and C# and normal .NET Core tooling. I'm a big fan of that, so that's why I really picked up on this one. It uses your MVC knowledge if you have some. Good documentation support. It's very, very customizable, and but the only somewhat con is it's not quite up to par with some of the other static site generators out there that have more features, but I'm hoping it gets there. So bottom line, pretty darn cool, pretty darn amazing by itself. Then when you add Azure Static Web Apps on top of it, it's got a ton of momentum behind it. It's becoming more and more used. It's really great to pair with Blazor WebAssembly if you're doing any of that. That's, I think, really part of the reason I think Microsoft made the technology is to have a place to serve out Blazor in a very, very cost-effective way. Tons of ways to go about it, lots of documentation. The one or two negative things I have for it are those deployments, they do take a little bit of time, but that's not that big of a deal. It's enough time to go get a refill on your coffee. There's a size limit to the amount of space that you can take up for your from your application. That's again why you'd want to use a headless CMS to have large websites and large amounts of content, because all that would be elsewhere if you want it to be. And then there's if you go over a ton of bandwidth, there's a little bit of pricing that goes up from there. Again, bottom line, pretty awesome. Kontent by Kentico, same thing. I really love using it for multiple years now. Again, it's any technology you want because it's API first. Doesn't even have to be .NET. However, I really recommend the .NET world. I think it's a great headless CMS. It's one of the market leaders out there. And I hope that you guys have seen a little bit of it this time as well. So if you are curious about like another more real world example of all the things I've shown today, this is a site that was developed in combination with Statiq and Kentico Kontent. It's called JAMStack on .NET, and it's an entire website. It's got menu navigation. It's got carousels. It's meant to be like a more real world example than just my hello world examples. It's fully working. Check it out, JAMStack on .NET. And all of this has a free GitHub repo that has all of that code that makes up that website. And that's that link at the bottom. So if you really want to try this out, that's another great way to do it. You can also use my repo if you want to look at it from a very simplistic standpoint. But this is another great example of using the technology. So with that, I've talked a whole lot, everyone. I hope you learned a little bit. I'm going to open it up for questions and discussion at this point. And once again, thank everyone at OneTug for having me speak. I hope it's been a good session. And I thank you all for paying attention.
Yeah, hey Brian. So I was really interested in the making static websites dynamic demo. So can you give us a 5-minute summary on how you implemented that? Because just there were a lot of moving pieces. Kind of want to put together that architecture.
Sure. So the dynamic aspect of pulling it from Kentico Kontent, or the aspect of hitting the APIs that pull in the content through the API, because there's two ways I tried to show it.
APIs, and I guess
okay.
Let's start with API.
Sure. Yep. Let's do that. So let's talk from the Razor syntax first. I showed you the output of the buttons where we said call API. This is the first HTML DOM fragment. Oh, sorry. This is the first HTML DOM fragment that I'm overwriting based off a response from an API. So it's a very simple HTML element with an ID that ties to that button that I said call API. So that calls message as a client-side JavaScript function. That is these 3 or 4 lines of code right here. So I'm simply saying use the built-in browser fetch API that most browsers have now. That's JavaScript based. Call to /API get message and pass it Brian as the name. Await the response of our API, and then basically just overwrite the text content of the name bold attribute. So I'm basically dynamically writing to HTML from JavaScript. That API get message is in our, when we look at it from the live site perspective, it's in the output folder API folder. And get message is again the same JavaScript I showed before. This is the root call or the main aspect of the function. It's responding to that query string of $name equals Brian right here on line 4. Taking that, building a string that's just responding, and then responding that in the response of the API call. So one thing that you can do if you're not sure, hey, how is this all working? You can actually debug it locally because there's all the framework is there to do that. So I'm going to actually attach to the node process here. I'm going to start running a debugger, and we can step through it at even a kind of a better level. Hopefully, if that thing ever finishes. So what this is kind of doing is it's actually running the node Azure Functions runtime package, making sure I have all that. It's doing all that for me, by the way. I didn't have to like set that up. And once it finishes, it'll open up a host process that's accepting API calls, and we can actually debug and step through the call to get message. Again, if it ever actually finishes. Okay, here we go. This is also one of the reasons I like .NET and not Node a ton, because there could be, you know, like hundreds of packages it needs to install. You never know what you're bringing down. Tip of the iceberg type of thing. It's almost ready. Actually, I think it's ready. Let me go back up a little bit here. I might have missed it. No, not quite ready yet. But what this is going to allow us to do is basically on our local machine, call the API directly just through a browser URL or even curl or whatever we want to do. And actually, we can see it all work. So is this the kind of thing that you were looking for, Santosh, in that question? I just want to make sure.
Yeah, and so that's one aspect. The other aspect was you also showed us how to integrate that with Azure Functions, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is the actual Azure function right here.
Right.
If this is in the code, you can actually see the Azure Functions core runtime is running. I'm not going to debug anyways. That's weird. It didn't usually do that. And it's starting up the Azure Function runtime locally for me and giving me, hey, you've got 2 endpoints. So if I control click this, I called get message because I controlled click it. It's hitting the debugger, and right now it's not going to find, if I just hit run, it's not going to find anything. So it's going to give me the response of, hey, the function triggered successfully, but please pass a name into the query string. So I put, sorry, name equals Brian. Now it's going to step back into the code, and it's going to find a name. Here, let me step through this one. So name is now Brian in the debugger. It's going to go through, it's going to get a 200, and it's going to return to me, hello, Brian. So it's that simple to run the actual Azure function. All of that is all kind of tied up together for you. And there's, now I say simple, but there's some configuration that it did for us. So get message is the API endpoint. We've defined the normal properties around Azure Functions, that this is an HTTP triggered function. It's anonymous. You can either get to it or post to it, and it has an output of a response over HTTP. So this is the same as if you were like going into Azure's portal and saying new function app and creating new Azure function. You're setting these same variables. So the function.js has the configuration of the function, and then the index.js has what you want your function to do.
So just out of curiosity, like, one of the advantages of static apps is obviously, it's static and you're not making any additional calls. So is this like an expectation that the function would be cached and then it would make this more efficient, or what's the I guess I'm looking for the trade-offs,
Yeah, this is definitely like a hello world example. In a more realistic example, you would probably have some caching around this. You'd have more logic probably. So the idea is, if we think about like your HTML page, your DOM here, you would sparingly use this to fill in parts of your DOM that you need to be dynamic. So, whether or not you have a careers page on your website and you need to provide a list of open positions to apply for, maybe that comes from another system, like Taleo or other things, or SAP or some other big career hosting place. This would be used to say, all right, I'm going to populate like my HTML around the header of the table and add like a filter bar, in like a React component or just pure HTML. But the data, I'm going to wait for the page to load on the client browser. And the minute it finishes, on document ready, we're going to call out to the other API that has the job opening data. You'd get that, and then you'd populate HTML. You'd like hydrate the DOM, if you want to use React words, to flush out all of those job postings in that grid. And that's a more like realistic example of that. Does that kind of help?
Yep. The final question. So now you also had a view in the portal where you could see the functions, right? So how do you make this transition to the portal?
So yeah, with the free plan, which is what I'm running, these are called basically managed Azure functions. You don't see them anywhere else. They're only showed up by name to make sure that they're detected the right way. And then the GitHub action does the actual deployment and provisioning of the Azure function. So you basically, you have to use their mechanism, and it's not as much control for you as if you brought your own Azure functions that you made as you're in a typical Azure function workflow. That is available if you move up to the standard, the paid plan for the Azure Static Web App. One of the differences is you can bring your own Azure functions, and that then you'd be able to connect to a function app and have the normal portal experience with your Azure functions and all the things that would go with it. But I'm not running the paid one for this demo. So those are the main differences between managed, where you can't do anything with it in the portal other than see that it's deployed the right way, versus bring your own, which is your whole normal Azure function workflow. Maybe you want a C# based Azure function, not a Node.js or JavaScript based function.
Okay, got it. Yes. Thank you. Thank you for clarifying. Yep.
The other thing I didn't show you, which I think is really cool, is that when you have the different environments and application settings, just like our normal app settings.json file, those are possible in the portal as well. So I actually have a couple endpoint values defined. I'll even show the value on this one, to deliver.content.ai. That's where I'm pulling the content headless CMS information from. That's actually managed per environment in the portal, or any other Azure Shell or whatever other way you want to massage data in Azure. But we also get, for every environment or every PR that we're making, it copies those base app settings for us. And that's what makes it available to the Azure function in Azure, because I've defined in my function, now I'm in the a little bit more advanced one, the get content, the process.environment value. The Azure Functions runtime gives us that, so we can actually use that when we're deployed into the Azure world, as opposed to having all of our connection strings or secrets buried in the Azure function. So that's pretty cool too, that you can actually use app settings hosted in the portal. And then if you want to run locally, of course, you'd still have the local settings. Again, here's what those same things look like. We've got deliver.content. Here's my project ID. That's what I would need to get the content out of content. But those match what then show up here. So the idea of environments and configuration with app settings, that's also possible, and it plays into those Azure functions that are in it, that show up here. And then this is the main production environment, that if I hit the main website, like production, you'll notice I have static content Azure Static Web App, the main production site, and when I go to the index from CS, I don't have that misspelling that we showed, but on the stage site, it's like -8, And as we bounce back and forth, you can see there's, oops, I don't want to do that. The way. So we bounce back and forth. These things are different. Actually, this might be a better one to show the difference. Because we've got two different environments. So this is the same file. It's the same code. It's just two different deployments. And that's what Static Web Apps gives us as well.
Cool. Thanks for the detailed explanation.
Mm-hmm.
I will let others ask questions now.
Any other questions from you all? Well, I hope you all at least learned something today.
I definitely learned something. So yeah, that was fantastic. Thank you. So the code for this is that the static Azure, the link that's posted in the chat, I guess, instead of reading it.
Yeah, let me go back to that. Actually, I just have the thing open. I just paste it in. I don't have it in there. All right. Yeah, I'll get you that. So there's the URL and that in the chat. Oh, Andy's got it. Yep, it's in there. Yeah. Any other questions?
Anything from the crowd? I mean, I guess there are no questions, so we can continue chatting, but
Sure.
yeah.
Anthony, thank you for that comment. Yeah, .NET functions are support as well. I was just trying to stay in the whole JAMStack world a little bit with mainly JavaScript things. But you're right, we're mixing technology. So hey, you want to do .NET, go for it.
Anthony, anything you want to tease?
Oh, I wasn't ready to speak, but sure. Yeah, come check out .NET Conf. I think we'll have some. We'll have a session there at 1:30 p.m. your time, I think.